So we begin today the Gemara on Daf Yutes Amud Beis, and the Gemara here brings many iboyas that Abaya asked from Rabba, and we're holding towards the bottom of the Yomah. The first word on the line is Royin. Boimene Abaya me Rabba. So Abaya asked the question from Rabba, Chitza Sakonim, if you put up these partitions that have to be placed in the corners around a well that we're speaking about here, but you make it from reeds, Kona, one reed, another reed, pachais mishloisha, and there's less than a space of 3 tvachim between these reeds. Nidin mishum diyumid. Does this count? Could you use it as this diyumid, which is the L-shaped partition in the corner? Oilav, or not? Perhaps this is considered to be a flimsy mechitza, as we learned in the previous Perek, and Chachamim were not makel to allow you to use such a kind of mechitza. Amalei tenisua, we learned this in a Braisa. Hayasham ilon, if in one of the corners there was a tree, oy geder, or a gate, or chitza sakonim, or a mechitza made of these reeds, nidin mishum diyumid. It could be used as a diyumid, as this L-shaped mechitza in the corner. My love, kone, pachas mishloisha. When it says chitza sakonim, this is the exact case that we were asking our question. When it's made up of reeds with less than a space of 3 tvachim between them. So the Gemara answers, Loi, that's not necessarily what chitza sakonim in the Braisa means. Gurdisa de koni. It could be that is gurdisa de kani, which means reeds that are growing from one place, and these reeds are connected at the bottom together. We're not talking about single reeds that he places near each other with less than a space of 3 tvachim between them. So if you take a look in the picture, in Kufayin Tes, so you can see in one corner they have a chitza sakonim, which is the reeds with less than 3 tvachim between them, and then you have in the picture the gurdisa de kani, which is also reeds, but they grow from one stem, from one place. And that's there's a reason to be makel more over there. It's growing from one place. Frakte Gemara, ihachi, if that's the meaning of chitza sakonim, hainu ilam. So isn't that basically the same thing as a tree, where you have a tree as the stump, and then you have the branches that come out? So isn't this the same idea? So why does the Braisa have to say a tree and chitza sakonim? Ve'elo, so the Gemara says, so what does this mean? Ve'elo mai Kone, pachas mishloisha. So what are you going to say? The pshat over here is that we're talking about a mechitza that you're making of these reeds with less than a space of 3 tvachim. So hainu geder. Isn't that the exact same thing as a geder? When it said that in one corner you had a gate. What's the gate made out of? Isn't a gate also a similar kind of thing where you have sort of reeds or whatever material that you are putting near each other to form a kind of a gate? So geder and chitza sakonim are the same thing. So what are you going to answer to that? Trei gavne geder. 2 different kinds of geder. They're not exactly the same kind of a gate. You could have a gate that's actually made out of bricks, solid bricks. And then you have the gate that's made out of these reeds that are placed in the corner. And the Braisa is saying 2 different kinds of gates. Now, what would be the chiddush over here regarding a gate that's made out of bricks, that it can be used for the corner? The chiddush is that it wasn't made for this purpose. It was just made there as a gate for something else, and now it happens to be in that position and you want to use it. So so too we can say, today, gavne ilon, that there are 2 kinds of trees. They're not exactly the same thing. You have a full big tree, that over there it's a thick tree, that over there you could say, like we had already before, that if you have a big rock or something that you can consider it as if you carve it out to be that L shape, that's okay. So that's one kind of case, that's the tree. And then there's the other kind of thing that's a tree, similar, but it grows from the bottom up, as we saw in the picture, these reeds that are growing from one root, from one stem. So they're not exactly the same thing, and therefore there's a chiddush in each one of them. So the bottom line is, we can say that it's hachanami trei gavni ilon, and therefore there's no raya from here to the case that Abaya asked about, which is the case of the reeds that are placed near each other. Ikedamri, others say that the question was different. Gurdisa de kani kamibayale. The question Abaya asked from Rabba was actually regarding Gurdisa de kani, this case where you have these reeds that are growing out from one root, from one place. That was his question. Gurdisa de kani kami boyele, Gurdisa de kani mai. What's the halacha b'negei to Gurdisa de kani? Amalei, and Rabbi answered him, Tenisua, we learned it in this Braisa. Hayasham geder, if there was either a gate, or ilon, or a tree, or chitza sakonim, or a mechitza made from reeds, nidin mishum diyumit. It could be used as this partition in the corner. My love, Gurdisa de kani. Don't you think? What does chitza sakonim mean? Gurdisa de kani. these reeds that are growing from one root. And so we see over here that this is accepted. So the Gemara says, Loi, kone pachas mishloisha. Perhaps we're talking about a kone, when you're putting these konim near each other, less than 3 tfachim, and that's literally made in the shape of this L-shaped diyumin. So now the Gemara is suggesting perhaps there's actually an advantage in having these an actual L-shaped mechitza in the corner, even though it's made out of these reeds and it's flimsy. But that might be even better than when you have these reeds that are growing out of one stem and it's not made in the proper L-shaped. So this might even be better. So there's no raya from here. Ihachi. So now the question is, if so, hainu geder. If you're telling me that the pshat over here in Chitzas Hakonim is that it's created like a partition in an L-shaped, isn't that the same thing as a geder, as a gate, or as a fence that's made in that corner? So, ve'elamai, the Gemara says back, so what are you going to say? Gurdisa de kani? That when it says Chitzas Hakonim, it means the Gurdisa de kani, the reeds that are growing out of one stem. Hainu ilan, as we said before, if so, it's going to be the same thing as a tree. Elamai yislach lemeima, what are you going to answer? Trei gavni ilan. It's not exactly the same as the tree. As I explained before, there's a chiddush regarding a tree, and there's a chiddush in this case. So, hachanami, trei gavni geder. Possibly, Chitzas Hakonim does mean the reeds and not what grows out of one stem, but still, there's two kinds of geder. There's a geder that's made out of bricks, and there's a geder that's made from these reeds, and therefore there's a chiddush in each one of them. So therefore, either way, whatever the iboya of Abaye from Rabba was, we don't have a clear raya from this braisa. Yet another question that Abaye asked from Rabba, Chotzer, shereisha nichnas lebena pasen. You have a chotzer that opens up into this area where you have this well and you have it enclosed with these pasen in the corners, so that's where the chotzer opens up into. So you can take a look in picture Kuf Pei, so you have the picture of the chotzer that opens up into Beina Pasen. So what's the halach over here? Are you allowed to carry from your chotzer into this area where there's the pasen over here? So the question is, do I say that you're carrying from one Rishus HaYachid to another Rishus HaYachid and that's not allowed without having a proper aid of chatzeris, or no? It's just one chotzer that's opened up into this area, Beina Pasen, and you're allowed to carry. It's directly opened into it and there's no problem to carry there. So the question is again, Ma'ala taltal mitoicha lebein apasim umibein apasim letoicha. Amalei. So Rabbi answered, mutter. It's allowed, not a problem. Shtayim. So now the question is shtayim. If you have two chatzeros that are opened up into this bein apasim, so what's going to be the din now? So now you actually have two different properties of two different people that are opened up into the bein apasim. So they're both using it. So the halacha always regarding a chatzir, two chatzeris, is that if you want to have a use between them, you have to have a native chatzeris. So over here, if they're both using these beina pasim, as you can see it here, if you want to see the picture of two chatzeris opened up, it's picture Kuf Pei Aleph. So they're both using the beina pasim. So perhaps you should need an native chatzeris for both of them to be allowed to use this one area that they're opened up into. Amalei, Aser. You're right. In that case, yeah, it would be Aser to carry from the Chotzer into the Bein HaPasim or from the Bein HaPasim into the Chotzer. Amar Rav Huna. So Rav Huna says, Shtayim Asurim, in a case where you have two Chatzeres that are opened up into these Bein HaPasim, it's going to be Aser Va'afile Irvu. Even if these two Chatzeres made an Eiruvin between them. In other words, if it's a case that you have an opening in the wall, if you take a look and picture Kuf Pei Aleph, so in the wall separating the two chatzeris, there's an opening, there's a doorway, and they made an Erev chatzeris between each other. So because there's an Erev chatzeris between them, so the fact that they're both opened up into the Bein HaPasim should not be a problem. They're allowed to carry from one to another, and if they're both opened up into the Bein HaPasim, what's the issue? They made an Erev chatzeris. But Rav Huna says it's not allowed. Va'afile irvu. Why? Gzeire sheme yoimru, because there's a gzeire, people will say, Eruv moyel lebein hapasim. That the Eruv works, if you make an Eruv chatzeris, then it works even for the bein hapasim. In other words, people are going to say, they're not going to realize that they made an Eruv chatzeris between each other because there's an opening between them. And people might think, even if there's no opening between the two chatzeris, but still they can both carry into it and they place an Eruv in the place of the bein hapasim. Like it's done by a mavoi. How do you carry from two chatzeres into a mavoi? So you make a shituf mavois. You're making the erev with the mavoi. Right, so people might think that you could make the same kind of Eruv over here with this Bein HaPasim, and you don't need an Eruv between the two Chatzeres, but that's not the din. This is not considered to be like a Mavoi, so the concept of Shituf Mavais doesn't apply over here. You actually need an Eruv between the two Chatzeres. So because people may not see that there's an Eruv between the two Chatzeres, so therefore we're geyser that even when you did make an Eruv, that it should not work. Rava says we're not concerned for this. People won't make this mistake, and therefore irvu mutter. If they made an Eruv Chatzeris between them, then it's allowed. Amalei Abai la Rava, so Abai says to Rava, Tanya the Messiah lachal bring you a brayse that proves your opinion. Chotza sherei echad nichnas lebein hapase, and a chotza that opens up into this area between the pasim of the well. You're allowed to carry from the chotzer lebein pasim into this area, or mibein pasim l'toicha, and from in between the pasim of this be'er into the chotzer. Avol shtayim, but if there's two chatzeres opened into this area, also it's not allowed. So basically, what Rabbi said before is clear in a brayse. Then the brayse says, "B'med dvarim amurim shaloi irvu." With two chatzeres open ben pasim, it's not allowed if they didn't make an Eruv chatzeres between them. Avol irvu, if they made an Eruv chatzeres mutarim, so then it's allowed. So leime to have it to yufte the Rav Huna. This is clearly refuting what Rav Huna said. Rav Huna said that there's a gzeira, but people might not notice that Eruv chatzeres, and they might think that you're relying on making an Eruv with the ben pasim, which doesn't work. So it's a question of Rav Huna. Amalach Rav Huna. So Rav Huna says, no, the pshat in the brayse is different. Hasam, the case in the brayse where it says irvu mutarin, the hadran ve'irvan. The two chatzerais were joined together as one. He broke down the wall in a way that they're joined together as one, as you could see in picture Kuf Pei Beis. So the wall, the front part of the wall is broken down, so therefore now the two chatzeres open up together as one into the Bein HaPasim, so therefore there's no need for an Eruv anymore. That's what the Brayse means to say when it says, B'med dvarim amurim shaloi irvu aval irvu. It's talking about joining the two chatzeres. But in the case of Rav Huna, there could still be a gzeira, as Rav Huna said. One more question that Abaya asked Rabbi. So another question Abaya asked from Rabbi, Yofshu mayim b'Shabbos mahu. So you have this takana that Chachamim said that it's allowed, you're allowed to rely on these Bein HaPasim, on putting up these partitions in the corners to be able to use it for the well water in the middle. But what's if it dried up on Shabbos? This was all a kula to use the water. But now if it dried up on Shabbos, so we don't rely on this. So what's going to be the din if it dried up on Shabbos? Amalei, so he answered him, Klum nasas mechitza ela b'shvil mayim. The whole mechitza that we accept to use it is only for the purpose of the water. But mayim ein kan, so mechitza ein kan. There's no water here, so there's no mechitza here either. So therefore we can't rely on this mechitza. Boy, Eiruvin asked a question, how about Yofshu mayim b'Shabbos? It dried up on Shabbos, but then ubo b'Shabbos, and then it rained again and it filled up again with water. Ma, what's going to be the din now? Now that it's filled up with water again, so it could qualify as a mechitza again. Amalei Abaye, so Abaye explains Ravin as follows: Yafshu b'Shabbos lo tibayalach. If it dried up in middle of Shabbos, so for that you don't have a question. Why? Because the Bayim Demar, I asked this question of the master of Rabbe, Upashatli da'asa, and he answered me that it's aser. So bo nami lo tibayalach. If so, if water came back into this bayir on Shabbos, it also shouldn't be a question. Why not? The havelei mechitza ha'asuya b'Shabbos, because then this mechitza is becoming qualified as a mechitza in the middle of Shabbos, and that's not good. Vitanya, we learned in the Brayse, or actually that is good. Sorry, the Brayse here will tell us that a mechitza made on Shabbos is good. As the Brayse says, Kol mechitza asuya b'Shabbos, any mechitza made on Shabbos itself, bein b'shoigig, bein b'meizid, bein b'in bein b'ratzin shma mechitza, whether it's b'shoigig, b'meizid, or in any situation. A mechitza made on Shabbos is acceptable as a mechitza. So if rainwater comes into the boyer on Shabbos and now it's acceptable as a mechitza, so it's good. But the Gemara asks on this, V'lav itmer Allah, did we not learn on this Brayse? We learned this in Gemara Shabbos as well. Amar Rav Nachman, so Rav Nachman said, Loishanu elo lizraik. Min atayre, we consider it to be a good mechitza. Aval etaltel loy, but midrabanan, to be allowed to carry in that area inside, if it was made on Shabbos, you're not allowed. So you can't really rely on this mechitza. So the Gemara answers, Ki itmer, the Rav Nachman amazed itmer. This that Rav Nachman says that midrabanan were machmer with a mechitza that's made on Shabbos itself, that's only b'nigeya to a mechitza that was made b'mezid. The mechitza that's made b'shoigig, or in our case, it's a mechitza that just happened naturally because it began raining and it filled with water. Such a kind of mechitza in middle of Shabbos, it's fine, you could use it, it's not a problem. Sagt die Gemara weiter. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Hazayrik lebein pasei haberois. A person that throws from the Rishus Harabim into this area that's enclosed between the pasei berois. Chayiv. You'll be chayiv, throwing from Rishus Harabim to Rishus Hayachid. Pshita. So the Gemara asks, of course, Ilav mechitzi, if it's not a good mechitzi, how would he be allowed to fill up water for the animals here? So the Gemara says, we need it in the following case. The Ovid ke'en pasebeirois b'Rishus Harabim. He's making this enclosure with putting the partitions in the corners, similar to the way it's done by the well, but it's not, there's no well there. And it's done in the middle of Rishus Harabim. V'zorek l'toicha, and he threw inside of it chayiv. So then he would be chayiv. Frek the Gemara, hanami pshita. This still should be obvious that minat Torah, this is considered to be a Rishus Hayachid. Ilav the ba'alma mechitza he, if usually minat Torah, this is not considered to be a good mechitza, gabi boy heichem mishtari le'taltali. How would Chachamim allow to use this regarding a burn? So true, could be midrabbana, this is not accepted as a mechitza because there's various issues. There's paritz merubal ha'omed, or there's the avir of both sides of the mechitzas that are mevatel. But minat Torah, it has to be that this is accepted as a mechitza always, and therefore Chachamim are allowing it to be used over here as well. So it's pashut that this is a Rishus Hayachid. Answers the Gemara, the case that we need is over here. The chiddush here is afagav the baki bar rabim. This is made in the center of Rishus Harabim, in an area that the people of the Rishus Harabim are going straight through in between these partitions that you placed in the corners. What's the chiddush? The chiddush here is that the rabbim passing through are not going to break these mechitzas to consider it into the Rishus Hayachid. There's definitely a svara to say that now that the rabbim is passing through it, the traffic goes through here, so it renders the mechitzas irrelevant. But we don't say that. Because you have the proper mechitzas minat Torah, the fact that the rabbim goes through there does not matter. So frek the Gemara, is that your chiddush? Ha'amar Rabbi Elazar chadazimna. But this is something that Rabbi Elazar already said. It's nan, because we learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yudaim, if you have a derech of the rabbim that goes through mechitzas, you shall kennel it zadim. So then you have to put it at the side in a place where the rabbim doesn't go through. But the chachamim say, ein it tzarech. It doesn't matter, even if the rabbim goes through, the mechitzas are good mechitzas. And Rabbi Yechon and Rabbi Eliezer Damri Tarvayu, and Rabbi Yechon and Rabbi Eliezer both said, Kan hidiyacha koichan shel mechitzas. Over here, we see from the Chachamim how powerful mechitzas are. That once you have mechitzas minat Torah that qualifies mechitzas, you could have 600,000 people passing through these mechitzas. It doesn't matter. The mechitzas are still good mechitzas. So we see already this point that Rabbi Eliezer said over here. So why does Rabbi Eliezer have to say the same point regarding the pasei berois? Zog the Gemara, if it was only over there that he said this, maybe he's saying over here the Chachamim are telling you how great the koyach of mechitzas are, but he doesn't necessarily hold to this. But over here, the chiddush is kamash malon kan v'svirele. So now he's telling you this. He's telling it to you as an actual halacha regarding pasei berois that he actually holds of this. So if so, let him just say the halacha right over here, that if you throw inside from Rishus Harabim into this area that you're chayiv, and I would know that he holds that this is the actual halacha, and he doesn't have to tell me what he said over there regarding the opinion of the Chachamim. Answers the Gemara, no. Choda miklal chaverta itmar. He didn't say it two different times. He said the statement that he holds like the Chachamim, then here you see the koyach of the mechitzas. And based on this, his students repeated and said, in his name, b'negei to the halacha, by if you threw into pasei berois, that even if the rabbim go through it, you're still going to be chayiv. So they learned it out from what he said over here. Going back to what we learned in the Mishnah. Mutter lahakriv lebe'er v'chulu. You're allowed to make the pasei berois around the be'er as close as possible to the be'er, as long as the roshei v'rubai of the behemoth could be inside to drink the water there. So the Gemara is going to start with another Mishnah that we learned in Masechta Shabbos, and then ask a shaila and come back and bring a raya from our Mishnah. So Tanan also, it says over there in a Mishnah in Masechta Shabbos, Lo yamei dadam b'Rishus Harabim. A person should not stand in the Rishus Harabim v'yishteh b'Rishus Hayachid and drink from a Rishus Hayachid. He's sticking his head into the Rishus Hayachid and drinking from there. Or Rishus Hayachid v'yishta Rishus Harabim. Or stand in the Rishus Hayachid and drink water from a Rishus Harabim. Because there's a concern that he might bring the water out into another Rishus. Elam kain machnes roishe v'rubulo makom shu shaisa. Unless his head and most of his body is in that Rishus of where he's drinking the water. V'chein begas, a similar halacha is also said regarding the halacha of meiser. Regarding the halacha of meiser, so the din is that when you have grapes that you're pressing in a press, or olives that you're pressing, so you're not allowed, you have to take off meiser. But if you're temporarily eating from it while you're inside in the press, in the area over there, then you're allowed to eat from it. If you take out, so it's not considered to be temporary anymore, so then you have to take meiser before you eat from it. So over there as well, the same halacha will apply. If your head and most of your body is inside, you're allowed to eat from it, it's considered to be temporary. But if you walk out with it, or most of your body is not inside, then you're not allowed. So Gabe Adam, so now the question is as follows. Gabe Adam ha'amad abai rosh v'rubai. So regarding a person that's drinking from another rishos, most of his body has to be in that rishos. Gabe para. But if you have a cow that's drinking and he's partially in one rishos and the water is in another rishos, mi be'ina la rosh v'ruba. Do you have to have most of the body of the animal in that rishos? Or maybe it's not necessary. So over here, the concern is that the person feeding the animal the water, if most of the body of the animal is not inside, the person might walk out with the water. So the question is, do we have that concern if the person is really inside? It's just the animal that's not mostly inside. So what's the shayla? The Gemara explains as follows. If the person feeding the animal the water is holding a pail of water in his hands, and he's not holding on to the animal either, if this is not a question, you certainly need most of the body of the animal inside. Because over here, there's definitely a concern that the animal will just walk away and walk outside. You're not holding on to the animal, and you're holding the pail of water, you're going to follow the animal outside. When do we have a question regarding this? You're holding a pail of water in your hands and feeding the animal with the water. And you're also holding the animal in your hands. You're holding the animal now. What's going to be the din? Are we still concerned that the animal will tear itself away from you and or pull its neck away and go out, and you might follow it outside? Or we're not concerned for that. We're not concerned, and therefore, even if it's not Rosh V'Ruba inside, you have control over the situation, and you're not going to carry out the water. Amalei, so he answered him, Tenisua, can't we learn this out from what we learned in our Mishnah? Ubulvad, over here regarding the Pasei Birois, how close could you bring the Pasei Birois? So it said, Ubulvad sheteya pora reisha v'ruba mibifnim. The cow, most of its body has to be on the inside. Vishaisa, and there it drinks. My love, what is our Mishnah talking about? Don't you think the case is the Nokit law? He's holding on to the animal. The Nokit mana, and he's holding on to the pail of water. And still, the Mishnah says that most of the animal has to be inside. So the Gemara says, Loi, not necessarily, that's not what the Mishnah is talking about. The Nokit mana. Our Mishnah is talking about a case where he's holding on to the pail of water, but V'loi Nokit la, he's not holding on to the animal. And therefore there's a concern that the animal will go out and you'll follow it. And that's why our Mishnah says most of the animal has to be inside. Wait a minute. If the case of our Mishnah is that you're only holding on to the pail, but you're not holding on to the animal, is that even allowed to feed the animal over here inside this area? Didn't we learn in a Braise? You're not allowed to fill up the water from the well and give it to the animal to drink on Shabbos regarding this case of the Pasei Birois. You could fill it up, and you pour the water out for the animal, and it drinks on its own, but you shouldn't feed the animal directly. So this Braisa, what case is this Braisa talking about? When are we concerned? That has to be talking about a case where you're not holding on to the animal. And because you're not holding on to the animal, we're afraid that it's going to pull its neck out and you're going to end up feeding it outside. So we see that in a case where you're not holding on to the animal, so then there's a concern you can't feed the animal either way. You just have to pour out the water. So in our Mishnah, when it says that you could feed the animal when Roshei V'Rubai Bifnim, and you're feeding the animal directly, it must be talking about a case where you're holding on to the animal. And still our Mishnah says, Roshei V'Rubai Bifnim, that most of it has to be inside, so it would be a raya to the question that we had. So the Gemara says, no. This Braisa you just brought up here is Bechlal not talking about this case. It's a different scenario. Ha'itmar Allah, we learned on this, Omar Abaye explains that that's really a completely different case. So in other words, really this Braisa could still be, our Mishnah could still be talking about a case where you're holding on to the pail of water and you're not holding on to the animal and you're allowed to feed it. In this Braisa where it says that it's not allowed, it's talking about a completely different case. And before we look into the words of the Gemara, the way the Gemara describes the case, So you could take a look in picture Kuf Pei Gimel, and this is the case that we're talking about. So we have an animal which is inside the Reshus HaYachid, and then you have Pasei Birois that are around the well of water that's sort of a little bit far away, further removed from the Reshus HaYachid. And then in between, you have this feeding pail, of a feeding bath, whatever you want to call it, that is there for the animal to drink from it. So over here, this is the case where there's a concern that you might fill up from this well, and then you might end up taking out that pail that you're carrying in your hands and putting it down into the Reshus HaRabim outside of the partitions that are surrounding this well. As the Gemara will explain now. Let's see. So Zok to Gemara. So Abaye said, Hacha be'evos ha'oimid b'Reshus HaRabim. So the evos, the feeding pail that the animal eats out of. Where is this positioned? It's in a Reshus HaRabim. And Gevaya Yut Tfachim v'Reichav Dalet. The actual feeding pail itself is tall 10 Tfachim and it's wide 4 Tfachim. So really it itself is Reshus HaYachid. Now, v'Roishei Echad Nichnas L'bein HaPasim. One end of this feeding pail enters into between the pasim, where you have the well, which is also a Reshus HaYachid, and the other end, as we see in the picture, is where the cow sticks out its head and eats or drinks from the Reshus HaYachid. So now, what does the person do? The person goes and fills up water from the well, and he brings it to this place, and he pours it in for the animal to drink from it. So what's the issue? What are we concerned about? The Gzeira here is, maybe when he'll come with his pail of water and he'll want to go with his pail of water and pour it over there right in front of the animal and feed it directly to the animal, he'll notice that there's something broken over here with this avos, the mekalkel, and he'll have to fix it. And he's carrying the pail together with him. So right over there, in that space between the Pasei Birois and the Reshus HaYachid, it's a Reshus HaRabim. The actual feeding pail for the animal is there in the Reshus HaRabim. He might put down his pail that he's carrying from the well to this area, and he realizes that he has to fix something. He might put it down right over there in the Reshus HaRabim. That's the concern that we have over here. So therefore, what does the Brisa say? If you're filling up water from the well, you have to just take it and pour it while you're still inside, between the Pasei Birois, pour it inside the feeding pail for the animal. You're not allowed to walk with it and bring it all the way to the animal. If you're going to walk with your pail all the way to the animal, you might end up putting it down in the Reshus HaRabim. That's the din that this Brisa is saying. A completely different story. Okay? So now the Gemara questions this pshat of Abaye and this Brisa. Fragt the Gemara, V'chi hai gavne, mi mechayev. If this would end up happening, the person filled up a pail of water from the well, and his plan was to just pour it into the feeding pail for the animal, which is also a Reshus HaYachid. So he did not plan to take it out in the Reshus HaRabim. But then later he will notice something is broken there, and he might end up putting it down in the Reshus HaRabim. So he's basically changing his mind. Is that something that would be a problem? Don't we know? We learned this in Shabbos. A person that's moving objects in his house from one corner to another. So he didn't pick it up with the intention to take out under the Reshus HaRabim. But then, and then midway, he changes his mind and he decides to take it out into the Reshus HaRabim. And he took it out, potter. He'll be potter. The akira that he did at the beginning was not with this purpose, to take it out to the Reshus HaRabim. The akira was done, it's not an akira of a hitzah b'chlal. It's an akira just to move it from one place to another inside. So over here as well, he's not thinking of taking it out into the Reshus HaRabim when he picked it up. He's changing his mind later when he notices something is broken. So what would be the problem? Ella, the Gemara says, the Gzeira is slightly differently. Zimnin, the Misakinle, sometimes he'll notice something is broken and he'll put the pail down in the Reshus HaRabim, and then V'hodam Ayale, he'll bring the pail back into the Reshus HaYachid, between the Pasei Birois, V'kama Ayal, Reshus HaRabim, Reshus HaYachid, and he might bring the pail back in from the Reshus HaRabim into the Reshus HaYachid. That's what we're concerned about. Okay, the Gemara now is going to repeat the same discussion that we had until here with a slight difference, but much of the next Gemara is a chazara, a review of what we just learned. Ikedamri, now others said that the question that the Gemara had over here is a little bit different. Gabe Yadam, when it comes to a person that's standing in one rishos and drinking from another rishos, Hakam Rinan Lei, the Sagile Bereisha Virubai, that as long as most of your body is in the rishus where you're getting the water from, that's good enough that we're not concerned that you're going to carry it out. Gabi para, regarding feeding a cow, misagi lo beroisha v'ruba. Is it even enough that most of its body is inside? Or maybe that's not even enough. Maybe an animal is wilder. The animal will walk out. It won't just turn its head away, but it'll actually walk out and you could follow it. So therefore, maybe even if a roiv of its body is inside, that's not good enough. So again, the Gemara explains, if you're holding the pail of water that you're feeding the animal with, and you're holding the animal in your hands as well, in such a case, it's enough that most of the body of the animal is on the inside. In what case is our question? The nakat mana, you're holding a pail of water feeding the animal, but you're not holding the animal, and it could very easily tear away and go away. What's the halacha? Are we concerned that you're going to follow the animal outside, and therefore even Roisha V'ruba should not be enough? Amalei, so he answered, what do you mean? Tanisua, we have this in the Mishnah. Most of the body of the para is inside and it drinks, and that's okay. My love, don't you think, what is our Mishnah speaking about? The nakat mana. He's holding the pail, v'loy nakat la, but you're not holding on to the animal, and still the Mishnah says, Roisha V'ruba is good enough. So again, the Gemara says, no, maybe our Mishnah is talking about the nakat man of a nakat law. You're holding the pail and you're holding the animal as well, and therefore in our Mishnah it's allowed. And it's logical to say this, the nakat man of a nakat law, because in a case where you're feeding the animal and you're only holding the pail of water, but you're not holding the animal itself, mishari, are you even allowed to feed an animal in this way, even if you have the pasiberois around it? But we learned in the Braise, you're not allowed to fill water and give it to your animal. You have to fill it up and pour out the water, and it drinks on its own. So that Braise must be talking about a case where you're not holding on to the animal, and it says that it's not allowed. So our Mishnah must be talking about a case where you are holding on to the animal. Okay, so the Gemara says, no, it's not a raya. And the Gemara brings again what we said before. That Braise is talking about a completely different scenario. The Avos is in the Rishus HaRabim, and it's Gevaya Asarat Tvachim V'Reichav Arba. The Avos itself is the Rishus HaYachid. V'Reishay Nichnas L'bein HaPasim. One end of this Avos enters between the Pasim, which is also a Rishus HaYachid. Now, the Zimnin, so now the person is filling up the water from the well, and he wants to pour it into the Avos, which is also a Rishus HaYachid, so there's no problem. But the Zimnin, if he's going to walk with this pail all the way further out, now Zimnin the Chazi Leila Avos, the Mekalkal, he might see that something is broken with this Avos, Vasil Sakune, and he wants to fix it, and he's carrying the pail with himself, the Kamapik and instead of feeding the animal over this Avos, which is all the area of Rishus HaYachid, he might put down the pail into the Rishus HaRabim, and he's taking out from the Rishus HaYachid to the Rishus HaRabim. That's the case that the Braise is speaking about. So again, the Gemara asks, in such a case, if you end up putting it down in the Rishus HaRabim, would you be chayiv? Anyone that's moving objects from one corner to another in a house, the nimlach alein, and you change your mind, and then you carry it out, your akira was not for the purpose to take it out, so you don't have the akira for the malacha of haitzah. Ella, the concern is different. Zimnin the Misakin lay, you may have to fix this Avos, v'hada, and you placed your pail down into the Rishus HaRabim, v'hada ma'ayale, and then you're going to end up bringing your pail back into the Rishus HaYachid, v'kama'ayale, and Rishus HaRabim, Rishus HaYachid. The concern is that you're going to be carrying in from the Rishus HaRabim to the Rishus HaYachid. Okay, so now the Gemara returns to bring a raya to the question that we're asking over here, regarding Roisha V'ruba. Do you have to have, the way we asked the question in the beginning, do you have to have Roisha V'ruba inside of the animal or not? Toshama, so it says in the Braise, when you have a camel and most of the camel is on the inside in the Rishus HaYachid, you're allowed to force feed it and it's standing inside. So now the Gemara explains, when you're force feeding a camel, so you have to hold on to the pail that you're feeding with, and you have to hold on to the camel to be able to open its mouth and force feed it. So you're holding on to the camel and to the food. And the and the Braise says that the only way it's allowed is if it's most of the body of the camel is on the inside. So we see that in this case you have to have most of the camel on the inside. Amar Rav Acha bar Avunas, Rav Acha bar Avunas says, Amar Rav Sheishes, Shani Gomol Hoyel v'Tzavarei Oruch. The case of a camel is different because by a camel that has a very long neck, so there's a much bigger concern that it might swing with its neck outside, and therefore, in such a case, it says that it has to be Rosh V'Ruba B'fnim. But in a regular animal that doesn't have such a large neck, maybe it doesn't have to be Rosh V'Ruba B'fnim. We don't have this concern. Toshama, we have another brayse where it doesn't say camel, it says Behema Rosh V'Ruba B'fnim. You have an animal that most of the animal is on the inside. You could force feed it when it's on the inside. Again, the Gemara says, V'ha'evos keman denoket mana v'noket la. When you're force feeding the animal, so you're holding the pail that you're feeding it with, and you're also holding the animal itself to be able to force feed it. And it says that you have to have most of the body of the animal inside. So the Gemara says, "My beheme nami diktani gomel." When it says beheme, it doesn't mean all animals; it only means a camel. Fragt the Gemara, but v'hatanya beheme, v'hatanya gomel. We have one brayse that mentions a camel specifically, and another brayse that mentions beheme. So the two brayses are not saying the same thing. So the brayse of beheme is telling you that this applies even to all animals. So the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Were these two brayses learned together, one after the other, that you have to say that the brayse that says beheme is not referring to a camel? No, maybe the brayse that said beheme, even though it said beheme, but it really meant only a camel, like it says in the other brayse. Tanya Nami Yachi, we learned in the brayse as well, Rabbi Eliezer oiser begomol hoyel v'tzavari yarach. Rabbi Eliezer says when it comes to a camel, so here if it's not Rosh V'Ruba inside, it's an issue because it has a long neck and it can swing its neck out. So we see clearly that we make a distinction between an animal and a camel. So therefore, the Gemara says is that we can't prove from this case, we only know this halacha by a camel.